Hello and welcome to the morning shot. Unfortunately, the live streaming service and things went down completely today. I think there has been a variety of outages across this country, so I couldn't live stream this particular interview. So I thought, let me just record it and upload it as a video right now. So if you are watching and you're wondering why there's no chat, because this was pre-recorded based on the circumstances that we had in front of us. So I hope you understand, but I think don't skip this. It's actually a very, very important topic, especially now in the year 2020, and notably, the decline of the Western world is happening at quite a fast rate, and I think our guest can maybe explain why. But without further ado, my guest is Auron MacIntyre, and he is what he calls himself a neo-reactionary. So, Auron, hello, and welcome to the Morning Shot, and thank you for staying with me despite all the technical difficulties.
Oh, no problem, man. Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
No, the pleasure is absolutely all mine. So I'm afraid I'm going to ask you this question for the third or fourth time now, due to the difficulties. But the term neo-reactionary has two words, neo and reactionary, and reactionary implies you are reacting to something or other. What in the 21st century are you reacting against?
So, kind of classically, the term reactionary is referring to people kind of like Thomas Carlyle and Joseph de Maistre, who warned that kind of the post-Enlightenment move towards, liberal democracies came with a set of problems that a lot of people had not thought about. They were focused mainly on the upsides that started to come around, but they were not looking at some of the downsides and some of the consequences of that. And what neo-reactionary thought, which has been around for about 15 years or so now, what that's doing is it's kind of a political analysis, and what it's looking at is modern liberal democracies in kind of our current time, and it's saying, does power work the way we've been told it works? Do liberal democracies actually operate in the way that we think they do? Because I think a lot of people, especially in, like I said, in 2020, are looking at liberal democracies and saying, I do not feel represented. It doesn't matter who I vote for or what happens. Things always seem to be heading the same direction. Why is that? Why does power seem to not respond to the things it's supposed to in a democracy? Is it really set up that way? And I think that's largely what neo-reactionary thinking is taking on.
Yes, so I think there's a sort of global trend now where we look at what we term as the elites versus everyone else, and you can see this in the national populist movements across the world. I mean, America just went through a period of time under Donald Trump of national populism. Most of Eastern Europe is populist, South America is populist, right populist, not left like Venezuela. But you have the arrival of populism, let's say half a decade to a decade ago, and these populists all sort of have the same message. And the message is the people running this country basically run it for their own power and their own wealth, and they don't really care too much about the ordinary citizens of that country. So is neo-reactionary sort of along that line, that there are perhaps a set of people somewhere in particular organizations or particular institutions or who have a particular job to sort of run and mold a country's psyche in their own favor?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that reactionary thinking in general has always been willing to acknowledge something that I think we forgot, or that liberal democracies were supposed to make us forget, that elites have always and will always exist, right? That there is always someone in charge. There is always a ruling class. What liberal democracies did is they told us that really we're the people are going to be sovereign, and the people will be in charge, and they will choose their leaders, and the leaders will respond to the people. What has happened is that story has not come to pass. Elites are still elites in the way that they've always been elites, but we've told ourselves a story where that's not the case. And one of the tricks that's really helped this has been the decentralization of power. So, for instance, in America, we're very wrapped up in this idea of our Constitution and the separation of powers. The Constitution has created checks and balances and separation of powers, and this keeps the government small, and it means it's responsive to voters, and it has to listen to the people. and its formal power is constrained, and therefore the people are in charge and not the elites. But anybody looking at American politics can pretty quickly tell that is not the case. So the question is, what happened, right? Did the Constitution fail? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. What the Constitution, I think, didn't take account for was the amount of informal power that the elites were then able to accrue to themselves. So rather than being focused on winning elections or getting Supreme Court seats in the United States, or the kind of things that we think would generate formal political power. What happened is that the power got moved into areas like the press, got moved into areas like corporations, got moved into areas like NGOs and these kind of organizations, international finance. And so what happened is that rather than the Constitution constraining power, power simply was shifted into an area where it's actually less accountable. And this is the problem we're seeing today is now we still have elites in charge, just like they've always been in charge. But now our elites are no longer obvious and out in the open. You no longer call them, Your Majesty, or they're no longer called nobles. Instead, they wear blue jeans and they drive around in SUVs that are slightly more expensive, but they are elites nonetheless. They still wield power. They simply wield it in an informal fashion. You won't be arrested in the United States for disagreeing with the government. You'll just lose your job and be depersoned on social media and destroyed. And I'm sure, obviously, this is mainly a United States centric analysis of power, but I think because of globalization and because of the push of international organizations, we can see this model play out in other countries. It's not a one-to-one. Obviously, situations in South Africa and the UK are very different, but I think I'm describing a phenomenon you might recognize in your own country as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, the theme is very, very similar. So I think a substantial difference between contemporary, global politics like today and traditional politics was that power was very easy to observe, right? Someone wore particular clothes or lived in a particular area or had a particular job and had a title, whether they be a priest or a politician or a mayor or something like that. Power was very easy to see and to understand. In a globalized world like today, with the internet, technology, there is decentralized power everywhere. But Mark Zuckerberg, for example, is far more powerful than 99.9% of all politicians, the world's ever known, for example. So they wield the same sort of power or more power than the most tyrannical king in history, but they don't use it. I mean, do they use it for political aims? Is that sort of the question at hand here? So does the power of social media companies, tech companies, NGOs, is it all political power essentially, or is it just a different type of power?
So it certainly eventually produces political power, but the trick is that it doesn't start that way. And so in Neoreaction, we have a concept that we call the cathedral, and you'll hear other people call this the deep state or globalism, whatever you want to call it. It's a very it has many names. It's a phenomenon a lot of people see, but they don't necessarily have a word for. The point that we'll see is that elites have a particular culture. And especially with globalization, you can see that in many ways, I think I saw your tweet about this, I think like yesterday, in many ways, an elite in South Africa has far more in common with an elite in Washington, D.C. in America than either of those elites have in common with the people living in their countries. Because globalization has created a class that is so separate from the people they rule that they have far more in common with each other than those that they are supposed to be serving and those that are supposed to be in a relationship with them in kind of that classical governing governance way. And so what we see is that a lot of these organizations like Facebook and Twitter and these other tech oligarchies, what they do is they abide by this elite culture. And the elite culture influences then what other people further down the chain can do and think and say, because elite culture is what is taught in universities. And everybody who's going to lead, whether it be in business, finance, the law, government, military, they're all going to be informed by elites in these universities. They're all going to have the same set of values, they're all going to have the same culture. And so what happens then is they are enforcing that elite culture through tech monopolies, through all these different things onto the average person, which is why it feels so unresponsive to the people below, because it's literally not their culture. It has nothing to do with their actual lives and their actual countries. And so it feels cruel and it feels foreign. It doesn't have to be direct formal power. It often eventually does become that. We often see the government slowly adopt these positions. But I think that's often what confuses people is they're like, why are these tech companies able to set the policy of my government? Or why are they able to destroy my lives in a way that I thought only government would have been able to do? And of course, these elites are not in any way voted on. They're not in any way selected. They're not even organically of the people like you would have seen elites be classically. And so they feel completely remote, completely distant, and unresponsive to the needs and attitudes and culture of the people they're in charge of.
So I think when we talk about ideas like this, especially the long march to the institutions, and people say, "Well, that's a conspiracy theory," but I always say, how many conservatives can you find in the greatest universities in the world? Often they are a minority, but not a minority as in 40%. They like under 10% for the most part, depending on what school you go to. But if we look at the long march to the institutions, where you have center left, liberal, Marxist, overtly Marxist people taking over these institutions since the 60s, since the 70s, no doubt they will change the culture of those institutions. And, the people who go into the institutions to learn something will inherently learn the same thing over a period of decades. Now, I mean, are you arguing, is this a conspiracy theory? Is this something that someone thought up or a group of people thought up somewhere? How do we get to a stage where, assuming you're correct, of course, that somehow we have a monoculture emerging from university? Is this a grand plan, or is it just the way the culture has changed over time?
No, I think one thing to understand is that neoreaction is very specifically, I think one of the reasons it is so powerful, I think one of the reasons that its political analysis is valuable is that it explains this without a conspiracy theory. So a lot of people look at the way that media organizations and universities and businesses and governments and NGOs all flow in the same direction, and they say, surely this must be coordinated at the top levels, right? Surely this spontaneous action all in the same direction, and no matter what voters, no matter what the people say, this has to be a conspiracy. But it's not. What it is it's a decentralized religion. Essentially, it is a culture that has been reinforced, as you said, that these people became prominent in institutions. They taught people who would then increasingly become prominent. I mean, and think about it. In the 1960s, I don't know what it's like, what it's like in South Africa, but the 1950s and 60s, you didn't need a college degree to become a store manager. You didn't need a college degree to become a an accountant. These were positions that you simply learned by doing after you came out of high school. Now, you literally have to have a college degree to get any kind of job that isn't working at a gas station in the United States, which means every single person has to go through this filter system. Every single person has to go to a college for a minimum of 4 years and soak in this culture. So of course the people who are going to be elite are even more soaked in it, right? The more elite you are, the more degrees you have, right? The longer you've been in this indoctrination, the longer you've been involved in this. And again, it's not a conspiracy, it's simply a shared set of values. And just like if you were living, let's say you live in a very strict Catholic society, you don't have to set up a conspiracy when something, let's say something happens in your society and everybody has a similar opinion about it, it's not because there was a conspiracy against the person in your Catholic society. It's because everybody was Catholic and they have a similar set of values. Their values are based on Catholicism. And so when something comes up, they reach for Catholic answers and Catholic solutions. It's a very natural process. It's the way humans work. Our values are created by shared institutions and shared cultures. Well, now all of our shared institutions and shared cultures, all of our consensus is created through universities and the people they educate. And so it's not a conspiracy, it's a bunch of individual actors each working on their own in the furtherance of their religious belief, in furtherance of their cultural, ideological belief. And it looks conspiratorial because it always moves in that direction, but really it's just individual people who hold a similar set of values who are militantly spreading those values not only in the United States but increasingly across the world through the globalization process, because of course, where do the majority of leaders get their education? Often through United States based universities, or universities that are sharing resources and peer review programs with United States universities. And so it is now something that has moved beyond the United States and often moves itself to other countries as well.
That is quite an interesting analysis, because I don't know if you know Nassim Taleb. He wrote The Black Swan and Skin in the Game.
I'm familiar with him, but I have not read his work. I hear a lot of people speaking well of him, but I have not read him.
All right, there's a chapter that's free online of his book, Skin in the Game, and it's called The Dictatorship of the Minority. And basically, he says societies across the world are actually dictatorships of minorities in their society. Whereas you can have someone, if you have two people, right, one person's halal and one is not halal, right? One cares deeply about being halal, the other doesn't care at all if his food is halal or not. If the one person is halal exerts enough pressure on supermarkets or butcheries or wherever there is a halal certification, those firms don't want to have an increased cost of differentiating between what's halal and what's not halal. So they'll just change everything in store to become halal, because those who really care will be happy, and those who don't care at all don't care either way, whether it's halal or not. So the calculation is the minority, the very intolerant minority, dictates the way a society has various things and various characteristics. So I think, in essence, your argument is along a similar line, where you have intolerant progressives. We'll get into what progressive means in a moment. You have intolerant progressives in sort of positions of institutional power who are able to, through the spreading of memes and things like that. And I don't mean memes like a picture on the internet. I mean like the real meme ideas, the virus of the minds. Just to spread that to hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes millions of people, through universities, social media, organizations, journals, newspapers, and things like that. Is that essentially what you are describing?
Yes, in fact, if you've never read it, probably one of the best places to start with Neoreaction is by kind of the grandfather of Neoreaction. His name is Curtis Yarvin. At the time, he wrote under the name Mencius Mulbug, but he has a essay called "How Dawkins Got Pwned." And Richard Dawkins is the creator of the idea you're talking about, the meme, right?
That's right.
And Richard Dawkins goes very deeply into how ideas can really have their own life. They can act as their own biological organism, right? And they can self-select for their own reproduction, that type of things, even though they're not actually biological entities. And Yarvin basically says, yes, Dawkins is correct, and he has exactly the mind virus he's explaining, because Dawkins was trying to explain religion as a mind virus. But of course, Yarvin points out Dawkins has a religion too. Everybody has a religion, right? We are mimetic creatures. Humans are, by design, exactly that. And so what happened is that, I know we were just going to talk about this, but in many ways, progressivism built itself on this idea of being it's basically dogma free, right? It's about science. It's about fact.
Evidence.
It's evidence. Yes, it is free of the small-minded, dogmatic, thinking of religion, and instead is based on modern, the truth is only what we can prove scientifically. But that, of course, can't possibly be true because humans don't work that way. We have to make non-scientific assumptions every day to get by. You can't build a culture purely on scientific, assumptions. This is the is-ought distinction, right?
Yeah.
Is that just because science says something is doesn't mean it's going to be. And so what happened is progressivism pretended to be all about science, but it was really just another value system in the garb of science. And that's why we see it pushed in this way so often, is that it's a value system pushed by your scientists, your professors, your media elites, your tech moguls, and so therefore it must be objectively true. But it's just another competing value system, and that's really all neo-reactionaries are saying, is you need to understand you are still adhering to a value system and a worldview. It's simply being preached by a different set of priests.
Yes, and I think that's the essential element here. I don't know if you know this book at all, called Straw Dogs by John Gray.
No, I'm unfamiliar.
So John Gray used to be a professor at the London School of Economics, and this book is a full frontal attack on humanism, right? And humanism, I think we can basically say, it's sort of progressivism as well. So humanism is nothing more than faith in humanity. And he says this is just Christian thinking without God. You just you're replacing God with your neighbors, and the assumption is that if you give people enough knowledge, things will progress naturally to some time in the future where there will be no more problems or no more starvation or any issues like that. And he says that is by far the biggest faith-based argument that he has seen in his life, expressed almost exclusively by atheists. So I think he has the same sort of argument as the neo-reactionaries in this regard.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the view that humans can be perfected, that the flaw lies within society, and at the end of the day, humans are only being held, their goodness is only being held back by evil institutions, and once those are fixed, humans will be able to return to their natural goodness. I feel like anybody who spent time with humans for more than 5 minutes should probably know that that's not true, right? We are flawed, tragic beings, and of course that story can't coincide with progressivism or humanism, because really at the end of the day, those are religions that worship progress. They worship development. Everything is eventually solvable. Everything is eventually, you can work it out. You just need to apply the right system, the right technology. At the end of the day, every human problem is just a fault of a bad application of a system. And once we fix it, we fix humanity. That usually ends up with people in ditches, right? Like fixing
Yes.
humanity usually ends very poorly for the humans you're attempting to fix. And this was well known. This is something we often, we look at older cultures and we think, barbarians, how foolish, how stupid. But pre-enlightenment societies understood the tragic view of human life, that there were just always going to be problems. And it's not that you don't work to better the lives of human beings, but understanding that at some point we are who we are. We are flawed creatures, and at the point we have to better ourselves as individuals rather than trying to collectively crush out inequalities and these type of things. But that's exactly what humanism and progressivism have turned into, is the attempt to crush out what makes humans human in an attempt to make them equal, to rather tragic results.
Yes, yes, and I think we haven't quite seen the results. I mean, we've seen the results in some ways. I'm rereading Theodore Dalrymple, who's a sort of classic British conservative author who lives in France for some reason. Just explains his mindset, because the British and the French don't get along. And he talks often about this notion of the coarsening of the social structure of society, especially in Britain, where things become coarser. People swear more, they get more tattoos, they eat food that's not good for them. There's a lot of pleasure-seeking behavior. Football has replaced the church and things like that. And he says a lot of this coarsening of culture has actually been from the top down. There's never been a sort of public mandate for the coarsening of culture. But the people who do control pop culture, the people who do control what people read and what people watch and things like that, they have coarsened the culture. So it actually flows down from the elites to the population. Whereas in the past, bourgeois values, right, from the working class to the middle class, those values were thrift, frugality, kindness, community, and sort of trying to remain humble in essence. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule, but since the 60s, since the 50s, there's been a great coarsening of culture, especially with the rise of corporate capitalism in some way. And essentially, I think if we put that analogy towards neo-reactionary thinking, the corporate structures at the top are the progressives, which are sort of undermining and negating the sort of individual and community aspects of those that they're selling to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the classic reactionary authors is going to be for political theory is going to be James Burnham. And James Burnham wrote a book, The Machiavellians. You can get it on audiobook. It's absolutely essential if you want to understand kind of the basic theories of some of this stuff. And he says the story of elites are the stories of cultures. Show me the elites of a culture, and I will show you the culture. They have always been the drivers. They have always been the tastemakers, and this only becomes more true as we become more interconnected. Right? We have far more contact. They're able to change culture very quickly. As you pointed out, a culture that is specific and has um, its own traditions and its own values and its own expectations of behavior self reinforces things that make it bad consumerly that make its people bad consumers. It means that they won't consume globalized products. It means that they need things that are specifically delivered to them. It means the values of their culture need to be taken into account when you're attempting to sell them something. This is all very bad for neoliberal techno capital, right? Like this makes it very difficult to sell things, and so it is much better to have people deracinated, to have them rootless, to have them lose those standards. Now, I don't think that was. I'm not on the bandwagon of this was the reason that the culture was pushed. I think that what happened is this was a happy outcome that only fed the fervor to push this culture down to the average person. I think at first the idea was we will free people from these constraints. We will maximize freedom. We will maximize liberty. Individual choice will be the watchword. And the problem is that what that did is it made people start to believe that they no longer needed to adhere to the norms of their cultural institutions. I don't need to go to church. I don't need to go to the bowling league. I don't need to go to the Elks Lodge. I don't need to belong to a book club. I don't need to, start a society. I don't need to serve my community. I'm an individual. My life is about me. My liberty is the thing that should matter the most. And it just so happens that as that person detaches themselves from the traditions and values of their culture and becomes coarser, it makes it harder for them to interact with the other people around them. This is why we see cultures falling apart, because they're all losing the things that bound them together, the institutions, the values that did so. But it also makes them great consumers because they're much more likely to identify with now Captain America is a global symbol now. Literally a piece of American propaganda is now far more understandable by people in China than it would have been to people in the 1950s or 1940s in America when it was used as propaganda. And I think that shows you what, I don't think that the need to sell things was the driving force, but once the ideology proved itself to be profitable, that only accelerated the desire for elites to deliver it en masse to people around the world.
Yeah, I think that really is a fascinating insight because also, if you look at okay, people are gonna not like me for this, but like the rise of feminism, right? The entire premise of first and second wave feminism, and whether you agree with them or not, I think this sort of stands true. It was about women should not just be the chattel of men, right? And we can agree with that statement or not agree with that statement. So they fought to get the vote and equal representation in law, which is fair and well. In the 70s, they said, actually, we got our fair representation in law. Now we need fair representation in private institutions. We need to break the glass ceilings because men are just as good. I mean, women are just as good as men at doing things, in business and things like that. And I think what we've seen from that sort of idea now is where we said to women, being a mother is actually bad for you. It holds you back from your goals, and your goals are to be the top accountant at this corporation or whatever your goal might be. So I think you have a lot of women who sort of pursued a path of financial and like job security. And then you find them years later without children, or maybe they're single, or maybe they're not single. But you find this sort of eternal loneliness amongst people, and not just women in this particular regard, but in general. You find this particular loneliness, especially in Western culture right now. Douglas Murray writes about it in The Strange Death of Europe, where you sort of almost become nihilistic towards your own culture because your culture doesn't do anything. It has no definition. And when there's nihilism in a particular culture, it dies and others come in and take over.
Absolutely. And if you look at what has happened to the culture as male-female relationships have degraded, there's no way to mistake it. Family formation is what puts skin in the game. Family formation is what creates community and loyalty. I am very lucky to have been married to a wonderful woman, but so many of my generation are more than content to play a video game when they get home, or watch Netflix, or whatever, because male female relationships are so broken that they can't even imagine engaging in them. And that means that they are just far more likely to consume and far less likely to build the communities that we've been talking about. And I think initially that was not the ask, right? If you read, there's a book by Christopher Caldwell called The Age of Entitlement. And it's a really great book about how the initial ask of kind of the civil rights and women's liberation movements were basically, these groups have been oppressed, and if we offer them the same opportunities, the misdeeds of the past will go, the grievances will leave, and we'll be able to move past these things. And that's what America and many other countries, many other westernized countries, said yes to. What actually happened is that instead these became the raison d'etre of the government, of the movement. The story of those countries became stories of civil rights. They were no longer individual stories about a people moving towards a shared goal, and they were solely about the emancipation and equity, equality, and then eventually equity of those groups. And so instead of it, for instance, being about women being able to, have jobs and inherit property and hold positions of power, instead it became about making sure that in every way women became men. It was not enough that some women wanted to enter the workplace. It was that all women had to. It wasn't enough that some wanted to move beyond a traditional family structure. It's that everyone needed to. And that's where progressivism ended up. It went well beyond the ask. It went well beyond the equal rights and moved directly into the inversion of the hierarchy that had existed, which was, I think, in the end, the actual goal. But it was not the initial ask offered to people who agreed to get on board with these movements at the beginning.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I agree with you entirely in that particular regard. And I think we see. I saw an article today. I read one by a man called Ed West, who's a British columnist, very, very good. And he also says, this concept in comedy of punching up and punching down. And there's been this notion of punching down is bad in comedy generally. And it always bad in terms of the context. If you look at if it's women or disabled people or people of a certain race or a different race, punching down in comedy is a terrible thing because reasons unknown. But if you look at punching down in terms of the rubes, the working class, those who do have values where you go to church on a Sunday and you stay married, despite things that happen in that marriage, and you want to have children. This concept of just being allowed to live at home with children and try to homeschool them and try to help them to self-actualize in some way has been the butt of jokes in our culture for what, close to 30, 40 years at this rate, and it's not slowing down anytime soon. So here you have elitist comedy culture telling poor whites or poor Latinos or poor blacks all over the place that what you're doing at home, the only reason you're at home is because you can't get into college because you're dumb, essentially.
I mean, for up until probably the last 10 years, comedy has been almost entirely about mocking the working and lower classes. It has almost all been performed at the expense of the average person. Now, don't get me wrong; they'll make fun of George Bush or a politician, but the majority of the jokes are, who are they aimed at? They're aimed at the religious. They're aimed at the traditional family. They're aimed at stuffy people, which are people who have values, right? Like they are the majority of comedy has been aimed, and please understand, I laughed at all of this stuff too. I'm not, I'm not saying I'm above this and how ridiculous, and
Guilty as
I
charged.
watched. Exactly. I watched South Park and thought it was hilarious. I laughed like everybody else when they did the uh, they took your jobs joke. But what is that job? What is that joke about? It's about making fun of lower class working people whose livelihood was erased by elites who wanted to sell things at lower prices. That's what that joke is about. It's not a joke about how stupid these people are. It's literally supporting the erasure of their livelihoods and their ability to make a living and their ability to raise their children. It's a joke at their expense. It's a joke about the destruction of their culture. But this was seen as, this is hilarious comedy. And you are starting to see now comics push back against social justice. You are seeing some comics, recognizing that the new hierarchy is exactly this, and so they realize that that's where you can mine comedy now. But for the most part, for a very long time, the comedy that we think of was simply aimed, yes, directly at lower class people. It was all punching down, 100%. That was its purpose.
Yeah, and it only became a problem when they started punching down on like lesbians or women or people of color. Then it became a problem, right?
Well, that's when you're actually attacking people above. That's how I know you're punching up, right?
Ah, interesting.
You're punching up when you're getting in trouble. You're punching down when you're hitting people who can't fight back. When you can make fun of all the people in trailer parks in Arkansas here in the United States all you want. No one's going to come to their defense because the elites don't care about them. They're not their power base. But once you start hitting something that is their power base, that's when you're punching up. That's when you're actually hitting people who have power. The most amazing thing that our elite class managed to do was to basically sell people this idea that those that were being privileged were actually those that were underprivileged, and that is why it's so confusing for people, because they think that's punching down. No, making fun of the guy who's stuck in a double wide and hooked on fentanyl, that's punching down. That's someone who has no one fighting for them. That's someone who has no representation in their society. But that's fine. You can do that all day. There'll be no pushback for that.
That's a very, very good point. When you get pushback, you actually, yeah, punching up. Good point, well made. I'll remember that going forward. So I think we sort of set a trend of what you are reacting against, right? The sort of progressivism, the sort of elite global capital that wants to sell more things, and in doing so, it coarsens the culture and perhaps undermines or tries to negate traditional cultural practices that end up leaving people being less consumeristic at the end of the day. So, neo-reactionaries, I think, see this problem, and I think it's an important problem to look at. We see the problem. What are the solutions to it, if you have any?
So this is probably Neoreaction is probably famous for having a really good read on problems and a very bad read on solutions. So, so I warn you in advance that if you go and you read a lot of neo-reactionary thought, you're going to find a lot of great analysis on how things work and why they're breaking down, and some very bad explanations of how to turn it around. I will
Right.
say,
I just want to preface this that I don't expect people to see the problems and analyze them to have the solutions to those problems. I think that's also a notion of, well, you need evidence. I mean, if you have evidence for the problem, you need sort of evidence and facts and truth about how you're going to solve that problem. And I think that's a bullshit argument for the most part. I'm happy just to analyze the problems, but you yourself, as Auron, if you have solutions for me, I'm more than happy to hear them.
well, I think there are some. I think there are some good answers to that question, though they are not holistic. So there's a couple different models to uh, to possible solutions against the kind of the current progressive uh, globalist push. One argument is simply that it will collapse. Right? We see a lot of incompetence. We see a lot of promoting people who cannot do jobs into positions of power. We see that, you know, the problem with attempting to break down cultures is that it leads then to civilizational collapse. Now that's a problem because nobody wants to live in that scenario, right? So that is one that many people offer, but one, of course, I, as somebody with a family, certainly don't want to see my family go through. So it's a solution, and it may be inevitable, but it's certainly not one that I think is a good one. I think that I think the most promising thing that many people have talked about is parallelism. And parallelism is the idea that basically what we need is a set of alternate institutions which provide a better product, essentially, to what's being provided. If you have a medical school that turns out doctors who don't believe in gender, you need a medical school that turns out doctors that do, right? If you have a economic school that pushes economics that lead to the collapse of civilizations and the destruction of peoples, then you need economic theories that can help people build those things and understand them. And so I think in many ways, uh, you can build institutions that will allow more classical understandings of truth to be recreated. Obviously, these will not wield the same power as those that are already in power, but simply by providing an alternative that and having the structure there, it means it's more likely that people will turn to it when they see the problems with the institutions that are failing. And it doesn't have to be only on the big scale, right? A big part of this, I think, is having people capture the smaller things. A lot of people will talk about stuff like the slow food movement and how that is something that is, I think, inherently kind of conservative and culturally, it benefits from a organic culture. And so there are many ways in which we can build personal networks and things in our lives. We can rebuild small pockets of more traditional cultures inside these things. Now, unfortunately, there are many people who will attempt to crush them, but I think you still have to you have to build them. You have to build them because if you don't lay the groundwork now, when I think more people become aware of what's happening and search for solutions, you won't have the solutions for them to go to. If you have those traditional cultural institutions set up, if you have a basic framework, if you already have a community forming, then that gives people a place to go. And I think that's probably where our work begins, is getting people to reconnect in that very organic way with their families, with their neighborhoods, find like-minded people in your area, form those voluntary associations that will give you options. Now, I also, when I spoke with Conscious Caracal, I think someone you know from South Africa, he came on my channel and did an interview, and he talked about how parallelism is actually being developed in South Africa in a very organic way because you simply can't rely on the government to do basic things like deliver power and food and water and safety. And so you're seeing communities building parallel in a far broader way than we do in America, because we still largely have those things available to us, and so the necessity hasn't come yet. But I think that is at the end, I think that is a perfect option. Actually want to learn more about what he's doing and what's happening over there, because I do think that is actually a way forward for many people.
Yeah, I was actually about to say, to me, that is a solution that I preach to people in South Africa who are my audience. So, just for a bit of context, in South Africa, we have a government which has very, very strong roots in classical Leninism, i.e., Bolshevik roots. They still think that it's 1933 and the vanguard revolutionary, masses still need to be set free through them, despite them being in power for 26 years. And also, they're very revolutionary and ideological, but they're also inherently very corrupt. So that prevents the revolution from actually happening for the most part, despite their best intentions. I mean, it's never something that you must discount, but their frailty is the fact that they're just greedy bastards for the most part. And because of their overt centralization of state resources and the corruption, i.e., the theft of state resources as well, we have this weird dynamic where you have a government that wants to be overtly totalitarian, as in like Nicolas Maduro totalitarian, but it doesn't have the money, expertise, and competence to do so. So there's this balance that just doesn't fit, and the consequences for South Africa is poorer citizens, less energy in terms of electrical power, crumbling infrastructure all around us. So there's a slow slide towards a failed state, essentially. And the solution to all that is, as you said, building up local communities that can take on and take over government services, and everyone gets to join in, and everyone gets to take part in making their community stronger than ever. And with the rise of cryptocurrencies, with the rise of 3D printing, with the rise of the internet, you can still be a small, strong community in the southern tip of Africa and still have a global footprint by selling products all over the world if you wish. It's very relatively simple to do. And Conscious Caracol, who is a good friend of mine, actually saw him this weekend. What his organization is doing is actually building up universities that offer classes in a certain language, Afrikaans, which is not allowed in a state university because of diversity, but they can do so because they have private investors. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who pay a monthly fee to that organization. And with those fees, they set up neighborhood watches, they build universities, they fix infrastructure, and they create a network of people across the country who all collaborate on projects and build alternatives to what the state has. And I think that is something wonderful, and I think it could be a model for the world in time to come.
Yeah, no, I think it sounds like a very promising project, and I certainly want to know more, because it is something that here in the U.S. we've talked a lot about, but it simply has not been practiced because we have not reached the state where people have to practice it, and unfortunately, a lot of people simply will not do it until they have to, which is kind of the collapse theory, right? You guys are closer to the parallelism because you're closer to collapse. You're already instituting many of those solutions on your own because you recognize what's coming around the corner. Many people in the US have a harder time, I think, seeing us moving that direction, but I feel like the last year should have probably made them aware that, we aren't as far off from that as we think we might be.
Yeah.
And so I think it's wise to probably learn from the example you guys are setting, because I think eventually we might see that.
Hey, if we can get hard currency like dollars in exchange for information, sure, that can work. 'Cause our currency is worth nothing. But Auron, I think I want to just close off very quickly on COVID-19 and the pandemic. To me, this has been the sort of the trigger for people to see that, the information that is wrapped up as science by these institutions, globalist and national institutions, it does not seem to gel with my worldview and my experience as a citizen of XY country, for example. And especially in America, where Donald Trump, despite being the vile fascist dictator, had no set of standards for the country. He said, I'll let the states decide what they must do. And some states took a very hard lockdown approach, some other states did not. And you can see, we'll see the consequences in time to come. But I think, does the COVID-19 pandemic and the sort of the lockdown scenario, does it show that the elites are losing power because it's incoherent, or this is like a final grab for the Great Reset, which does exist, by the way. There's even a book called The Great Reset. You know, up yours, New York Times, that says it doesn't exist. So what exactly is going on here, and how does this sort of the progressive view of the world dovetail into this COVID-19 pandemic?
So I think one of the great things about again, kind of that the cathedral model, the decentralized power model, is that it explains a lot of what happened with COVID-19. So, for instance, I don't think that COVID-19 was intentionally released. I don't think any of those conspiracy theories are correct. I think it really does kill people. Any of the tinfoil hattery, I think, doesn't apply. But
Yeah.
if you're progressive who has been looking for a reason to reduce carbon emissions, has been looking for a reason to restrict internet speech, has been looking for a reason to do all these things, and you have already set up the narratives as to how that should happen, then what COVID-19 does is basically just provides you the opportunity, right? If you already have everything in place beforehand, then it's very easy to simply have something come along that allows you to move in that direction. And so, again, I don't think it's that. I don't think a lot of people look at COVID-19 and they'll say, okay, obviously, like the scientists say one thing and then 10 minutes later it's something else. None of it makes sense. Joe Biden voters can dance in the streets arm in arm and they're immune to COVID-19. Black Lives Matter protesters in the United States can light buildings on fire, gathering, tens of thousands in the streets, and they're not subject to COVID-19. But anybody going to church, that's dangerous. Anyone running a small business is a real problem, but Walmart and Target can stay open as long as they want in the United States. The mega corporations, Amazon, can make massive profits while watching all the mom and pop stores die. Again, it's not a conspiracy. It just so happens that all the regulations are easier for large companies to follow and harder for small companies to follow, because the large companies are the ones who've been writing the regulations for years. And so I think that in some ways it does make it more obvious, right? We do see what we're seeing is a bit of we're seeing a bit of a shift. For a very long time, progressivism has relied on soft power, right? It's relied on the soft power of these institutions we've talked about, the universities and the scientific communities and media and all these things. In some ways, it's more powerful than it's ever been, which makes it sloppy, right? Because these people, you see, like, for instance, with the United States election, you see the New York Times openly saying, like, sending out a tweet saying, "We declare who wins the presidential election." Like, they literally sent out a tweet saying, "It is our job. We have the power to declare who the president of the United States is," which is an amazing thing to admit out loud. So in some ways, it becomes more sloppy. They also, because I think the internet makes it easier to show that to kind of show that their message discipline is not what it used to be, because the internet makes it easier to capture them saying voter fraud's not a thing now, but capture them saying voter fraud is a huge problem literally 6 months ago. Capturing them saying masks don't work in February, and then saying masks are the only thing that can save us and we have to wear them forever, makes it harder for them to manipulate information the way they used to. It's too obvious. And so that means, on one hand, they are more powerful than they've ever been, but on the other hand, they have to use their power more and more explicitly and in the open in order to maintain control. The bad news for us in the short term means we have to deal with all of this censorship and the terrible effects that has. In the long term, it makes it more and more obvious whose team they're on. what they're doing, right? It becomes more evident, more and more people see it, so that they are exercising more powerful and becoming more powerful, but their power is becoming more brittle, and hopefully that means eventually it breaks.
Yeah, ideally, but I think this year has shown us a variety of things, and none of them really good. I mean, I quote the World Health Organization on my channel a few times because they keep being quoted by our government when they impose some form of regulation or some form of lockdown. And even the things coming from there is nonsensical for the most part. I just don't understand why 2020. Is there a conspiracy to be had that maybe Donald Trump needed to get out of the White House on a level that we've never seen before? And I mean, COVID happened and then people just pounced on this. I don't know if it goes that deep. That's my tinfoil hat that's on my head right now. But why 2020? How can we get to this sort of this clash of the overt tyranny to make us safe in such an overt way? That's what I don't really get.
So I think you're right that if it was not Donald Trump, we wouldn't be having this. To be very clear, if Barack Obama was president of the United States and a disease with less than a 1% mortality rate hit us, we would not have imprisoned people in their homes. We would we would not have destroyed the schooling of children. Would not have threatened to arrest people for having Thanksgiving. I think that the media. I think Donald Trump is in many ways is the last gasp of conservative political uh, exercise of power in the United States. He's the last attempt of people who see something is wrong with it, and that's why they're willing to elect a guy like Donald Trump. He's literally the only one crazy enough to say things that will get him in serious trouble and have him fight serious power. And so they knew that he had to go. Now the smart move would have simply had been to bide their time and let him fade away, right? But like to just keep smothering his attempts to change the course of the country, keep using the bureaucracy and the media to just kind of control him the way they've controlled conservative movements for a long time. But the problem with Donald Trump, and the beauty of Donald Trump really, is he makes them so angry. They're so entitled. They're so sure that they have the right to rule, and that anyone who opposes the right of them to rule is stupid and backwards and bigoted and deserves to be crushed and deserves to be pushed into a later age. They're Neanderthals walking among us. They have such contempt for people who would support him that they simply cannot help themselves. And what this does is create this foaming at the mouth exercise of power. You can literally watch journalists screaming political propaganda at our vice president as he leaves press conferences. And if that doesn't show you what's going on, you just don't have eyes to see. If you can watch members of the quote unquote objective press screaming left wing talking points at politicians, uh, then there's simply nothing. You'll never see it, right? And so I think that's why we're seeing it. I think also, like you said, it does facilitate so many of the desires that globalism has had for the world. I think it makes available all the things that they wanted. It allows them to impose the restrictions they've wanted. The internet is a huge problem for them. It in many ways facilitates many of the things they want to do, but they realize the double-edged nature of it as much as anyone, and so they've been looking for excuses to crack down on these type of things. And so I think again it all flows in their direction. I think there are certainly bad actors. I think there are certainly people who are working towards nefarious ends. But if you're wondering why it seems like they're all working simultaneously, I don't think you're going to find a cabal of people who are sending out, fancy sealed envelopes with nefarious plans in them. I think you're far more likely to see a system that has been given the proper incentives to go along with the program that they are now pushing on people across the world.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest the the Chinese Communist Party had a very good propaganda and bot army, especially on Twitter,
Hmm.
to harass and stalk politicians across the globe, telling them that if they don't lock down, their people are going to die, and how dare you let your people die, and a variety of other things. There's a great guy on Twitter called Michael Senger, Senger, I think that's his name, whose whole timeline is about there's this great propaganda from the Chinese Communist Party who set the agenda with the lockdown, which was affirmed by the World Health Organization and praised for the non-pharmaceutical intervention in COVID-19. And then miraculously, most countries around the world somehow locked down. But we never talk about the countries that never locked down, that are doing much better without the lockdown, like Taiwan, for example, which doesn't exist as a country, of course, according to the World Health Organization.
Right.
So yeah, there's a variety of factors at play here, all of which is very, very fascinating. But basically, ideally, don't focus on the macro issues, focus on the local issues in your area. Build up strong networks, strong institutions in your area that can defend you and your community. And I don't know, wear out the storm.
Yeah, I think the important thing is to realize that unfortunately, when you have a system that is this calcified, that is this entrenched, it is difficult to play the game that we're told we need to play. This is a failure, I think, of the right in America over and over again. Is we've been told that if we just keep voting for Republicans, then eventually they'll fix this problem for us from the top down, right? And what we've seen repeatedly is that at the end of the day, they just become part of the system. They just become Orwell's outer party. They're
Yeah,
simply
they're
a
part of the
place to
cathedral.
exactly. They simply become a safe place for people who are angry to air their grievances and then go back to living under exactly the system that they are invested in. And so if we really want to see change come, I think that while eventually it will have to be at the large scale political, I think that what can the individual do in their time? I think they're far better doing what you said, bettering their life, bettering the lives of the people around them, conserving these values that we're talking about, the communities, the families, building the institutions that can give people alternatives, so that when this system does ultimately prove to be the failure it has to be, there will be another option for people to go to. I think in the end that is hopefully one day there are better options. But I think right
Yeah,
now that is the best option we can do for ourselves and those that we care about.
yeah, no, indeed, indeed. As Jordan Peterson once said, clean your room first, and
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
focus on other things. So this is a way of cleaning your room. Well, Mr. MacIntyre, this has been absolutely fascinating. I do apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but thankfully we managed to sort those out, and I've found this to be extremely enlightening, and I really sincerely think my audience will find it as well. For those who are interested in following Mr. MacIntyre, all the links are in the description below. I highly recommend subscribing to his YouTube channel, following him on Twitter, and also why not pop a few dollars into his subscribe star if you want, this sort of content to keep going. It is literally creating your own community on the internet, and we can fund those communities as well. So, do you have any final thoughts or things that maybe we should have spoken about that I neglected to speak about?
No, man, I think this was a great conversation and I really appreciate you having me on. Like I said, it's been really interesting. When I started this, my political understanding was very America centric. And so it's been very interesting I've made a lot of friends, South Africa, UK, Germany, other places. And so I learn just as much and it makes it very interesting for me to see how these ideas play out and learn about how these forces have worked in other countries. So I really appreciate you having me on.
The pleasure is indeed all mine, and no doubt we'll do this live in the very, very near future. So, everyone just do keep an eye out for that. But thank you very much, Aaron. Have a lovely, lovely day. And for the rest of you, have a lovely day. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. See you soon. All the best. Bye bye.